First, thank you for giving me the opportunity to step in, but I take this as a challenge. I like the music very much as well. So, begin with start this very important topic personally to me. I thought it would be appropriate for each one of us, the panel first, to kind of say a few words about your background and particularly your interest in dry eye. And from that, maybe to talk about what areas you can particularly talk about it from research to commercialization. Maybe start from Michael, from your.
Good morning. This thing's on. Yeah, I'm Mike Stern, and I'm an immunologist. I was at Allergan for 24 years, and my work was primarily to define dry eye as an autoimmune-based inflammatory disease, and that led to the acquisition and development of Restasis, or topical cyclosporin, which we used for many years.
Thank you.
Do I have to? Oh, you can hear me. Perfect. Great. Hi, I'm Cecilia Ketting. I'm actually an optometrist. I practiced for last 10-ish years in Virginia at Virginia Eye Consultants alongside John Shepard, Liz Hugh, some really big powerhouses that taught me quite a bit. So have a lot of experience in corneal and ocular surface disease and have spent the last year moving into a much smaller practice, building up a dry eye specialty clinic, and really delving into that alongside of lecturing my peers and educating through articles and whatnot as far as ocular surface disease.
Thank you.
Robert Dempsey. Currently, I'm focused on the back of the eye, but my experience primarily through the course of my career has been on the front of the eye, in particular dry eye. I was involved early in the launch of Restasis, both with Allergan and then Inspire. At Inspire, I worked very early on with diclofosol and also with azosite as we migrated towards potential indication for lid margin disease. My claim to fame, though, as the global head of ophthalmology at Shire, responsible for building and launching that franchise, in particular Xiidra. And then, of course, we were asked to divest that franchise, and in particular Xiidra, for all in over $5 billion. So I'm going to be, my expertise is on the commercial side, so I think we've got a great panel here that covers all aspects of the business. So here we go.
Well, what a panel. I think dry eye is such an interesting disease. I know today we heard so many great new ideas. I personally was very impressed. I mean, you may not know, I started to get interested in dry eye during my fellowship at Mass Eye and Ear Infirmary. At the time, Dr. Ken was very kind enough to put me in what he called dry eye clinic, and I have no idea about what dry eye is. And by the time when I started my career at Bascom Palmer, and I told my colleagues, I said I was interested in dry eye. And they said, wow, what a wonderful situation. They dumped every patient to me. So that's how I know the dry eye is such I call that a garbage collector. So it is a very messy area, very complex. I mean, even today, we sitting here, we probably need to scratch our head again. How can we define the well, and how we can come up a kind of mode of action, or come up some new paradigm, and to treat the dry eye? So I want to start by asking the question: how can, based on what we learned these 2 days, there are so many different approaches, new to me. Using peptides, recombinant proteins, targeting in specific area. Do you see, from your perspective, this area of our dry eye mechanism of action? Do we see something we learn, or the concept being evolved? How can we give a new ideas or perspective from your point of view?
I have a comment with that. I think that when we started out, the term dry eye meant that we needed to wet the eye. And clearly dry eye is not a disease of dryness. It is a disease of altered tear film composition. And we heard in several of the presentations leading up to this session that a return to homeostasis is what these compounds were doing. And I was glad to see the work with Lacretin and the other things that are actually restoring tear protein components and allowing the patient to return to normalcy. And I think that that's one of the big changes. And then the additional thing, I think Mark Gleason mentioned it, and that is reduction of symptoms. And I did a lot of fancy immunology, and I would sit down with a good friend of mine who was a rheumatologist here in San Diego, Bob Fox, and give him my recent papers. And I remember him looking at me and saying, that's really great, but you just missed the entire point. And the point is that none of my patients come to me complaining about their T cells. They're all coming to me because they hurt. And essentially, that's what all of this is all about, is getting rid of symptoms in dry eye patients and allowing them to return to normal quality of life.
Yeah, and just to build on that, we did a tremendous amount of research with patients, and at the end of the day, the thing that drives them into the office is they want symptomatic relief. And what I was super excited about today was, we're seeing earlier and earlier onset of action. We're seeing, these presentations focused on symptomatic relief of these patients. And from a commercialization perspective, if these patients aren't feeling better, they're not going to get a refill. They're not going to fight their way through the insurance programs to go through step therapy. If their eyes don't feel better, they're not going to fulfill those prescriptions. So, whether it's MD or OD, but Cecilia,
Yeah, no, I was going to say, and on the other side, as being a physician, if my patients aren't getting better and they're not having less problems, I'm not going to continue to prescribe it, right? It's not fixing the issue. It's creating more of an issue for me. It increases chair time, which then affects our productivity, our ability to get more patients in who really need to be seen. So I think, yes, symptoms and getting the symptoms under control is super important. I think even past that, having come from or being in an MD-OD practice, preparing my patients for surgical prep and getting them under control. And as somebody was talking earlier about surgical outcomes and making sure that we're treating patients prior to make sure we're getting the most appropriate and the best possible surgical outcomes, I think that starts to, again, for us as clinicians, we start to look at those and the dollars and cents that goes with that as well. Yeah. And then I think one of the other presentations also talked about contact lens dropout. And I think that's another thing, especially as a clinician, the amount of patients who have evaporative dry eye, and we're really looking at meibomian gland dysfunction and the poor quality and the loss of homeostasis, as you spoke to. And that causes problems with our patients and can also significantly impact our clinics financially.
The complexity is not just the disease definition, but also the complexity in the ocular surface as a per se. Absolutely. For example, we just heard this morning, the lids, the Demodex, for example, and then we also heard the meibomian gland dysfunction, the keratinized plaque, that blocking the secretion. Both are very common. And then dry eye is a common disease. Now you add these two other common diseases into the picture. How we select the patient in the clinical trial? Do you have any, because in early days, both the Allergan study and later on the Xiidra study, I don't know you pay any much attention about the lid disease and how that been building in your patient eligibility, inclusion, exclusion. I was wondering.
You want to take that, Michael?
I'll leave the clinicians and you guys to do that. I will say that we, way back then, I don't think we took the lid disease into account at all. However, now, when you start talking about very severe dry eye syndromes, a lot of them start on the lids, like graft versus host disease, for example. You see it in the lids early, and so that becomes an important indicator.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in. I think what Tarsus is doing and what Azura is doing is super exciting. I mean, you know, the great campaign that Aziz was talking about, thinking about the lids, looking at the lids. I mean, that's really going to drive a tremendous amount of awareness, tremendous amount of utilization as he prepares and they prepare for their launch. I think what Azura just shared today, Mark and the team, great job, super exciting. And I think that's just another avenue to approach the management of dry eye disease is through lid management. I mean, we talk a lot about dry eye disease, but in reality, what are we talking about? We're talking about ocular surface disease. We know lid margin disease is a major, major contributor to evaporative dry eye. So there's just so many more avenues to approach this and educate clinicians about this disease. We know the number is massive. I mean, we know, you know, between Xiidra and Restasis, we're probably looking at a market of well over $1.5 billion. And we now know that with multiple other programs coming out, this market's only going to increase with more awareness of this disease and better tools to manage the disease.
I think that's a key right there is the better tools to manage the disease, because when we talk about in clinic, so many doctors, we know we're looking at meibomian gland dysfunction, we're looking at keratinized plugged glands, and you know, there's just not a great option for treatment for our patients, nor is there great compliance in what they actually do. So I know as far as for use of these types of technologies and advancements and treatments, I think it's going to have a lot more closure of that gap of those who are diagnosed versus those who are treated, because the doctors are going to be able to actually use something that's more functional and easier for patients to implement, an ointment twice a week, right? Versus warm compresses every night, nutraceuticals, and all of these other things that they probably aren't doing anyway. So I think these are just really exciting things that are definitely going to help as far as in clinic and really have a lot of value.
I'm glad with the panels seems to agree to not to focus the so-called dry, just a dry per se, but the entire ocular surface, right? That's important. But in clinical trial environment, I mean, you have to be very careful in tease out this complex elements. And I remember reading the FDA guidance in the dry eye study. The only thing they ask for exclusion is the so-called severe blepharitis. There's nothing more than that to differentiate that into MGD or even Demodex blepharitis. It's just something important for the group here interacting with the regulatory agency, and also knowing that the disease is complex, but then if that is mixed into the study population, I think it's very hard to entertain the primary endpoint, particularly the symptoms. Talking about the symptom, obviously, it is the nerve, right? Nerve is controlling the sensation. So on one hand, the patient in the early phase, they have a good nerve, so they have a lot of symptoms. But once the neurotrophic element developed, as disease progresses, even in pure dry eye, we know the cornea sensitivity gradually decline. In that setting, the symptom no longer can be correlated well with the disease severity. So I'd like to invite the panel to elaborate a little bit your view about the nerve, and particularly linking also what we have just learned about neurotrophins and how that can affect our management, particularly in the future development of new drugs. May I start from Robert?
Well, I'm going to defer to Michael and Cecilia as the clinicians. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I think pain is probably the biggest area of research right now in dry eye. You know, we've done all the immunology and all that stuff. Everybody is looking at pain right now, and it's been a very under-investigated part of dry eye, but Schaefer's exactly right. I mean, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road here. There's been a lot of work on TRPM8 receptors and driving tear secretion, but it's not just amount of tears, it's composition of tears that you're driving. And, you know, is TRPM8 a target? Probably. You know, and some of these things maybe want to be investigated in response to that, these are the types of fibers. Also, the pores that TRPM8 uses, the TRPV1, that is a big area of investigation right now and should be looked at. I don't know whether you folks at Dompe are involved in looking at that, but that's all over the nerve fibers that you're looking at. So it's kind of a big deal here. So, again, I agree with Schaefer that pain is what's going to be the next wave of treatments for dry eye. And, I'm sure Lacretin and the other things have effects there, and it would be interesting to know why. Yeah.
So talking about nerve is not just control the secretion of tear components such as aqueous tear. Even you can call Meiben under the potential nerve influence. But another key reflex controlled by corneal nerve is blinking reflex. But at this point, I haven't heard anything from this group or from the industry how to incorporate that into the discussion, not just in the mode of action for managing diseases, but also for the future investigation under the regulatory trial.
I mean, just to build on that, is there a regulatory pathway for that? What I was super excited about today with the data that was presented from multiple companies is the ability to achieve both a sign and symptom, whether it's in their phase 2 or as they approach the phase 3, because that's going to be the regulatory hurdle to get approved. And, looking back at the development program of Restasis, we know how Restasis got approved. And, with Xiidra, we were the first one to accomplish both a sign and a symptom in a clinical trial. Now you have multiple companies presenting with signs and symptoms in clinical trials. And to me, that's a pure path to regulatory approval. So I think bring it back to the regulatory side of things. I think the companies now have learned through, the early trailblazers of what it's going to take to get these programs approved. And I think we can see multiple programs approved over the next, 3 to 5 years. And again, I think, being 2 new programs for lid margin disease and ocular surface disease from the lid perspective, I think is going to be super exciting as we look at the horizon.
I agree.
Well, by looking the nerve as the focal point, and then, we cannot. And also, we agree the nerve also trigger the blinking reflex, which coordinate with the tearing reflex to control tear film stability. Then clearly the dry eye cannot be just a pure aqueous issue or even lipid meibomian gland issue. It may well be the blinking insufficiency issue, which is linked not just a poor blink, but also even your blink, but the blinking is ineffective.
Yeah, your blink rate decreases. We know that the blinking helps to release the meibum. The meibum helps to, keep the tears from evaporating. So yes, it's absolutely all related. And we see in patients who have Parkinson's and decreased blink rate, we start to see this continued breakdown and then damage further on into the nerves themselves, which if there's damage to the nerve, the blink rate then decreases. So it is absolutely part of it. And I think we've become a lot more aware of the nerves and neurotrophic keratitis and people who are even lower levels of NK, especially since the race of Sinidromin with Dompe. I know for talking with other clinicians, a lot more of us started to just think a little bit differently about that, and that a lot of our patients actually may have more of a component of NK along with all this other ocular surface disease. And then going back to that then affects blinking, blink rates, it's that cycle.
Another point I realized, attending to this meeting, I noticed there is an increasing attention to the using dual action, or multiple targets, instead of focusing on one particular action or target action. So in that regard, I want to the panel maybe to comment how you view this approach. From anti-inflammatory aspects, you have multiple modes of anti-inflammatory as one approach, or add that together with other actions in addressing disease. I mean, for multifactorial disease like dry eye, I just cannot imagine it is a single target. But then if you choose to do multiple targeting, what would be your approach?
Well, I think we saw that with Surface, right? I think what Cameron presented today was super exciting. I mean, not just meeting the expectation of the market leaders, but potentially beating them. And I'll jump right to that type of information is going to be extremely valuable to who? The payers, because that's what they're going to look for. They're going to look for differentiated data. And I credit what that team is doing from the standpoint of clear differentiation, because putting my commercial hat on, that's what's ultimately going to get paid. If these patients can feel better, if it's a multimodal action, you convince the payers, and then these patients feel better, I think you have a clear shot on goal there.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely points where it's a multifactorial disease, right? Why are we not treating multi-things? I am in the clinic with multiple different treatments, and that decreases the amount of chair time again with the patient, and it decreases the amount of time for the patient to be doing things, which then is more valuable for me as a practitioner to want to prescribe these things and feel that that's something that would be very helpful. I also think that in these, we're talking about flares, we're understanding flares as far as dry eye a little bit better. Medications that are going to control those signs and symptoms, more specifically the symptoms for those patients and the chronic flares or the flare-ups that we have, along with the chronicity of ocular surface disease. I think that's important. One thing I would like to see is something as far as talking more specifically about optometry. There's still a lot of shyness around using steroids. I love steroids, they're awesome. However, my colleagues don't all feel the same. Yeah, that's a whole discussion. But things that, if you're looking for something as far as optometry, maybe that is anti-inflammatory, that's not steroid based, because that's a hole right there that they would probably jump in.
Yeah, so clearly, if the therapy is daily, and then you have to use every day, do you think that kind of therapy, as we have noticed from the industry as well as in the practice, it seems like patients gradually drop out?
Yes.
The refill is not there. So in order to address this challenge, what the panel will provide some kind of insight. What would be the alternative, for example, to provide the lasting benefit rather than a short-term benefit?
I'll jump in there first. I think it's super important to do market research, understand what the patients want. What is the target audience? I mean, going back to what we did with Xiidra and Jennifer Anderson, it's that female patient. What does she want? That lady between ages of 40 and 60, you have to understand what that patient wants and how to address what she's looking for. And I'd urge all these companies that are approaching market or doing even early phase work to better understand what that patient is looking for.
So do you think they're looking for a lasting benefit?
Absolutely, but we also know that once they start to feel better, and if they have any obstacles at the pharmacy, what are they going to do?
Yeah.
They're going to drop. And the clinicians deal with that all the time. That was the biggest complaint our sales organization had, is the minute there was some obstacle, or even if they started to feel better, then they would stop using, and only to the flare component, then they start having their symptoms return, then they start using the medication again. So we see a tremendous amount of lapse in their treatment utilization of the product. And I'm sure you see it from a clinician standpoint.
Michael, you've been in the industry dry eye for a long time. Do you see there will be a kind of approach would deliver lasting benefits, so that would not be a daily application?
No, I think that it's getting better and better in that regards. I think, one thing we need to understand is that dry eye is a two-hit process. There's an underlying weakness in the immune response on the ocular surface. There's a lot of immune tone on the conjunctiva. It's exposed to everything we're exposed to all the days, every day, and we're responding to that all the time. And then there's a precipitating event that causes the kickoff of the disease, et cetera, and we can bring the patients back to the first status. And, I mean, I've heard the word cure being kicked around this morning, but I don't see that. I mean, not in any model I've ever looked at that there's an actual cure. But we can manage the patient back to their baseline sort of disease and resolve the symptomology doing that. So I think, managing expectations in the patient and saying, look, we can bring you back there and you're going to feel a whole lot better, but you don't need to stop this medication because whatever it is helping.
That's great. Really thank the panel for excellent discussion, and thank you all for the participation. Thank you.